Good evening, and welcome back to Just About History. Tonight we are going back more than 3,000 years to a world that was richer, more connected, and more advanced than most people ever imagine when they think about the ancient past. And we're going to watch that world slowly come apart at the hands of the people history barely remembers. We call them the Sea Peoples. Nobody really knows who they were. Nobody really knows where they came from. But by the time their story is finished, entire kingdoms that had stood for centuries will be gone. Cities will burn and never be rebuilt. Languages will disappear, and the map of the ancient world will be redrawn from nothing. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. It helps these stories reach more people who need something calm to fall asleep to. And if you'd like, drop your location and your local time in the comments below. There is something quietly nice about knowing people are pressing play on this same story in so many different time zones, all of you settling in for the night together. Now get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights, pull the blanket up a little higher, and let your mind drift backward in time. Tonight we begin in a world we are calling the world before the storm. To understand what was lost when the Sea Peoples appeared, you first have to understand what existed before them. And what existed before them was, in many ways, the first truly connected world in human history. Not connected the way we think of connection today, with phones and aeroplanes and instant messages, but connected all the same. Kings who had never met each other called each other brother in their letters. Goods travel thousands of miles by ship and caravan. A piece of amber from the cold shores of the Baltic Sea could end up buried with a noblewoman in Greece. Tin mined in the mountains of Afghanistan could end up forged into a sword in Egypt. This was the Late Bronze Age, and if you stood at its peak somewhere around 1200 BC, you would have been standing inside one of the most sophisticated networks of civilization the world had yet produced. Let's start with Egypt, because Egypt sits at the center of almost everything we are going to talk about tonight. By 1200 BC, Egypt was already ancient. Think about that for a moment. The pyramids at Giza were already more than 1,000 years old by this point. Egyptian civilization had been running continuously, with all its ups and downs, for well over 1,000 years before our story even begins. The pharaoh sitting on the throne as our story opens is a man named Ramesses III, though we will spend more time with him later. For now, just picture Egypt as the dominant power of the eastern Mediterranean world. The Nile River flooded every year with a predictable, almost miraculous rhythm, depositing rich black soil across the farmland on either side of its banks. This single river made Egypt one of the most food-secure places on the planet. While other civilizations worried constantly about famine and drought, Egypt most years simply did not have to. This food surplus is what allowed Egypt to support huge populations of people who did not farm. Soldiers, priests, scribes, architects, artists, people whose entire lives were dedicated to something other than growing food. That is, in a very real sense, the foundation of civilization itself. Surplus food creates specialization, and specialization creates everything else. Temples, armies, written language, monuments that last for thousands of years. By this point in history, Egypt had also become a military empire. It controlled territory well beyond its own borders, stretching up into the region we now call the Levant, which includes modern-day Israel, Lebanon, and parts of Syria. Egyptian garrisons sat in cities along this coast. Egyptian officials collected tribute from local rulers. The pharaoh's reach extended far past the Nile Valley itself. And to maintain this empire, Egypt needed wealth, and wealth meant trade. Egyptian ships sailed the eastern Mediterranean constantly, carrying grain, gold, linen, and finished goods out, and bringing back timber, copper, tin, and luxury items from other parts of the world. The pharaoh's court was, among other things, the centre of an enormous international economy. But Egypt was not alone at the top. Far to the north, in the mountainous interior of what is now Turkey, sat another superpower, the Hittite Empire. The Hittites are a civilization that most people today have simply never heard of, and that is, in its own quiet way, part of the tragedy we are going to walk through tonight. Because in their own time, the Hittites were not a footnote. They were a true superpower, every bit the equal of Egypt. Their capital city, Hattusa, was a massive fortified complex built into the hills, with walls thick enough to withstand the siege weapons of the era and temples dedicated to a vast pantheon of gods that the Hittites had absorbed from the many cultures they ruled over. The Hittite king did not simply rule a single ethnic group. He ruled an empire made up of dozens of different peoples, speaking different languages, worshipping different gods, all held together through a careful and surprisingly sophisticated system of vassal treaties. This is actually one of the most remarkable things about the Hittites, something that often gets lost. They were pioneers of something we would recognize today as international law. When the Hittites made agreements with other kingdoms, they wrote them down in careful legal language, with witnesses, with specific terms, with clauses about what would happen if either side broke the agreement. We still have copies of some of these treaties today, carved onto clay tablets that have survived more than 3,000 years. One of the most famous is the treaty the Hittites signed with Egypt itself, after decades of warfare between the two empires finally exhausted both sides. This treaty, sometimes called the Treaty of Kadesh, is considered by many historians to be the oldest surviving peace treaty in human history. Copies of it exist in both Egyptian hieroglyphics and Hittite cuneiform, and remarkably, a copy of it hangs today in the headquarters of the United Nations, a quiet reminder that diplomacy is not a modern invention. So by 1200 BC, Egypt and the Hittites are not enemies anymore. They are something closer to wary, exhausted partners, bound together by decades of memory of how costly their wars had been. And this peace mattered, because it allowed both empires to focus their resources elsewhere. It allowed trade to flow more freely between them. It allowed both kingdoms to enjoy a kind of stability that had not existed a century earlier. This is important to understand, because stability like this does not happen by accident. It takes generations to build. And as we will see, it can be destroyed in a fraction of that time. Now let's sail west, into the Aegean Sea, into the world of Mycenaean Greece. This is centuries before the Greece that most people picture when they think of ancient Greece. This is not the Greece of Athens and democracy and philosophers in togas. This is an earlier, more mysterious Greece, ruled not by city assemblies, but by warrior kings who lived in massive fortified palaces. If you have ever heard of Agamemnon, or the city of Mycenae, or the legends that would eventually become the stories of the Trojan War, this is the world those legends came from. The Mycenaean Greeks built palace complexes at sites like Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns, and these palaces functioned as the administrative heart of entire regions. Scribes inside these palaces kept meticulous records, written in an early form of Greek using a script we call Linear B, tracking everything from the number of sheep in the kingdom to the rations given to palace workers to the religious offerings made to the gods. This is something people often do not realize about the Bronze Age world. These were not simple societies, they were bureaucracies. They kept records the way modern governments keep records, just on clay instead of paper or computers. The Mycenaean palaces controlled vast economic networks, taxing farmers, organizing craftsmen, managing trade, and the Mycenaeans, like the Egyptians and the Hittites, were deeply connected to the wider Mediterranean world through trade. Mycenaean pottery has been found as far away as Italy, Egypt and the Levant. Mycenaean traders, and likely Mycenaean raiders too, sailed constantly across the Aegean and beyond. And then there is Cyprus, an island that does not get nearly enough attention in most retellings of this era, but which was absolutely critical to the entire system. Cyprus was one of the richest sources of copper in the ancient world, and copper, remember, is one half of the recipe for bronze. The other half is tin, which is far rarer and had to be imported from much further away, in some cases possibly from as far as modern-day Afghanistan or Cornwall in Britain, though historians still debate exactly how the tin trade routes worked. This matters more than it might seem, because bronze was not just a metal used for jewellery or tools. Bronze was the metal of weapons and armour. Bronze was, quite literally, the material that determined military power in this era. Every kingdom in this story needed a steady supply of both copper and tin to arm its soldiers, and that need tied every kingdom in this story together into a single fragile economic web. If the tin stopped flowing, armies could not be properly equipped. If the copper stopped flowing, the same problem occurred. Cyprus, sitting at the crossroads of all this trade, became enormously wealthy. Its cities filled with copper workshops and merchants from a dozen different cultures. And just north of Cyprus, on the coast of what is now Syria, sat a city that perhaps best represents everything wonderful and everything fragile about this interconnected world. Its name was Ugarit. We are going to come back to Ugarit later in this story, because its final days are recorded in some of the most haunting documents to survive from this entire era. But for now, let's appreciate Ugarit at its height. Ugarit was a true international city, a place where merchants from Egypt, the Hittite lands, Cyprus, Mycenaean Greece, and a dozen smaller kingdoms all came together to trade. Archaeologists excavating Ugarit found tablets written in no fewer than 8 different languages and scripts, all stored within the same archives. Egyptian goods, Hittite goods, Cypriot copper, Mycenaean pottery, all passed through Ugarit's harbour. The city's wealth came not from producing anything itself, necessarily, but from its position. It sat exactly where the great empires of the era needed to pass goods through, and it grew rich simply by being the place where the world met. This is the picture I want you to hold in your mind as we drift through tonight's story. A web of kingdoms, each different, each independent, but all bound together by trade, by treaties, by royal marriages, by shared economic dependence. Pharaohs writing letters to Hittite kings calling them brother, Mycenaean ships docking in Egyptian harbours, Cypriot copper flowing into Hittite forges. This was, in its own Bronze Age way, a kind of globalization, and like most systems built on deep interdependence, it had a hidden weakness. When one part of the system breaks, the damage does not stay contained. It spreads. Let's talk for a moment about how kings of this era actually communicated with each other, because it tells you something important about how fragile diplomacy can be. We know about much of this thanks to an extraordinary discovery made in Egypt, a collection of clay tablets called the Amarna letters. These are diplomatic letters written mostly in the century before our story, between the Egyptian pharaoh and the rulers of other great powers, as well as smaller vassal states throughout the Levant. Reading these letters today feels remarkably human. Kings complain to each other about gifts that were not generous enough. They ask for gold, always more gold, sometimes with a kind of polite desperation. Smaller vassal rulers write to the pharaoh begging for military help against rivals, warning that without Egyptian support, their cities will fall. There is one particularly famous set of letters from a ruler named Rib-Hadda of the city of Byblos, who writes to the pharaoh again and again, increasingly desperate, warning that enemies are closing in, that he needs soldiers, that without help his city cannot survive. The Egyptian response, as far as we can tell, was largely silence, and eventually the letters from Rib-Hadda simply stop. We do not know exactly what happened to him, but the implication is not comforting. I bring this up because it establishes an important pattern that we are going to see repeat itself later in our story, on a much larger and more devastating scale. Smaller kingdoms in this era depended heavily on the great powers for protection, and great powers, even when they wanted to help, were not always able to. Distance, the slow pace of communication, competing priorities elsewhere, all of these things meant that a city under threat might send out a desperate plea for help and simply never receive an answer in time. Keep that pattern in your mind, we will return to it. Now, let's turn to the question of who exactly the Sea Peoples were. Even though, and I want to be honest with you about this up front, nobody truly knows the full answer. This is part of what makes this story so strange and so compelling. We are not talking about a single nation or a single army with a known homeland like the Egyptians or the Hittites. The term Sea Peoples itself is not even something the Sea Peoples called themselves. It is a label invented by modern historians in the 19th century, based on descriptions found in ancient Egyptian texts that referred to certain groups of raiders and migrants as people coming from the islands or from across the sea. The Egyptian records name several distinct groups under this broad umbrella. There are the Shurden, who appear in Egyptian texts wearing horned helmets and carrying round shields and long swords. There are the Luka, who most historians believe came from a region in southwestern Anatolia. There are the Ekwesh, the Teresh, the Shekelesh, and later, in a separate and even larger wave, the Peliset, the Cheka, the Denyen, and the Weshish. Each of these names refers to what was likely a distinct group with its own origin, its own homeland, its own reasons for moving. They were not a unified army marching under one king with one banner. They appear to have been a loose coalition, sometimes allied with each other, sometimes fighting independently, made up of people from many different corners of the Mediterranean world. And this is where the mystery deepens, because historians still argue passionately about where many of these groups actually came from. Some, like the Shurden, may have originated in Anatolia or even further west, possibly connected to the island we now call Sardinia, which may have taken its name from them, or perhaps it is the reverse, and they took their name from the island. Some of the Ekwesh have been tentatively connected by some historians to the Achaeans, an old name for the Mycenaean Greeks themselves, which raises an absolutely fascinating possibility that some of the people who would later help bring down the Bronze Age world were themselves displaced Greeks, refugees or raiders from a Mycenaean civilization that was already beginning to crack apart from within. The Peliset, who we will spend much more time with later in this story, are widely believed by historians to be connected to the people who would eventually settle in Canaan and become known to history as the Philistines. So even the basic identity of these groups is layered with uncertainty, connections, half-answers and educated guesses pieced together from inscriptions, pottery styles, and the slow, patient work of archaeologists digging through layers of ash and rubble across 3,000 years. What we can say with more confidence is this. By the final decades of the 13th century BC, these groups, whoever they were exactly, were already known to the great powers of the region. They appear, scattered and small in number, as mercenaries serving in the armies of established kingdoms. There is evidence the Shurden, for example, served as elite mercenary soldiers within the Egyptian army itself, fighting for the very pharaohs whose other branches of these same peoples would later attack. This detail matters because it tells us something important. These were not unknown, mysterious outsiders appearing from nowhere. They were already part of the fabric of the Mediterranean world, woven into its armies, its trade networks, its ports and cities, long before they became known as raiders and conquerors. So what changed? What turned scattered groups of mercenaries and minor raiders into a force capable of bringing down some of the most powerful kingdoms on Earth? This is the question that has occupied historians for more than a century, and tonight we are going to walk through this slowly, the way the people living through it would have experienced it, not as a sudden catastrophic event with a single clear cause, but as a slow accumulation of pressures, each one manageable on its own, building towards something that, in hindsight, looks unstoppable, but which, at the time, would have felt like simply one difficult year after another. Let's start with the climate, because increasingly, modern science is pointing toward environmental pressure as one of the deepest root causes of everything that follows in our story. Researchers studying ancient pollen samples, sediment cores from lake beds, and tree ring data from across the eastern Mediterranean have found growing evidence that the region experienced a significant period of drought beginning sometime in the late 13th century BC and worsening into the 12th century. This was not a single bad harvest. This appears to have been a sustained, multi-generational shift toward drier, less predictable conditions across large parts of Greece, Anatolia, and the Levant. Now think back to what we discussed earlier about Egypt's incredible advantage, the predictable flooding of the Nile that gave it food security that other civilizations envied. Most of the other kingdoms in this story did not have that advantage. The Hittites, in particular, depended heavily on grain grown in the relatively fertile plains of central Anatolia and, increasingly, on grain imported from other regions, including Egypt itself. We actually have a remarkable piece of evidence for this. Surviving letters show the Hittite king at one point requesting emergency grain shipments from Egypt and from Ugarit, describing a famine so severe that it threatens the stability of the kingdom itself. This is a superpower, one of the two dominant military forces in the entire region, openly admitting it cannot feed its own people without help from its neighbours. Imagine the kind of strain that creates. Crop failures mean less food. Less food means hungrier populations. Hungrier populations become more desperate, more willing to leave their homes in search of better land, or more willing to take by force what they cannot grow themselves. And when this kind of pressure builds simultaneously across many different regions, you get movement. You get migration. Groups of people, sometimes whole communities, begin looking for somewhere else to go, somewhere the harvests are better, somewhere life is more survivable. And when people move in large numbers, especially armed and desperate people, they do not always move peacefully. There is a theory, one that has gained significant support among historians and archaeologists in recent decades, that the Sea Peoples were not, primarily, conquerors seeking glory and empire. They may have been, at least in large part, refugees and migrants displaced by exactly this kind of environmental and economic collapse in their own homelands, whether that was Anatolia, the Aegean Islands, or elsewhere. Some of the Egyptian inscriptions themselves seem to support this idea, describing the invading coalition not simply as armies, but as groups bringing their families, their ox carts loaded with belongings, travelling not like a military campaign but like an entire displaced population searching for somewhere new to live. This detail, when you really sit with it, changes the entire emotional shape of this story. we are not necessarily talking about a straightforward tale of villains attacking innocent victims. We may be talking about something closer to a desperate, sprawling refugee crisis, one that unfolded across the entire eastern Mediterranean, colliding violently with kingdoms that were themselves already weakened and struggling to hold their own systems together. And this is the other crucial piece of the puzzle, the piece that explains why this particular crisis, unlike so many crises that came before it, did not stay contained. The Bronze Age world we have spent this chapter describing, this glittering network of trade and diplomacy and interdependence, was also, by its very design, extraordinarily fragile. Remember what we said about bronze itself. Every kingdom needed both copper and tin to arm its soldiers, and tin in particular had to travel enormous distances along trade routes that crossed multiple kingdoms and required peaceful, stable conditions to function. If those routes were disrupted, even in just one or two key locations, the effects would ripple outward across the entire system. Armies could not be properly re-equipped. Military advantages could shift rapidly. Kingdoms that depended on imported grain, like the Hittites, were similarly vulnerable. A disruption in one place could trigger food shortages somewhere else entirely. This is sometimes called systems collapse theory, the idea that the Bronze Age world did not fall because of any single cause, not the sea peoples alone, not drought alone, not earthquakes alone, but because all of these pressures arrived at roughly the same time, in a system so interconnected and so specialized that it had very little ability to absorb shocks. Think of it like a complex machine with thousands of interlocking parts, a machine that runs beautifully as long as every part keeps functioning, but remove enough parts at once, disrupt enough of the connections simultaneously, and the entire machine can grind to a halt, even if no single failure, on its own, would have been enough to stop it. As our story opens, none of the people living through these years could have known any of this, of course. They could not see the whole system the way we can today. Looking back with the benefit of archaeology and climate science, and thousands of clay tablets slowly translated over the past century. To them, these were simply difficult years, a poor harvest here, a grain shipment requested from a neighbouring kingdom there. Reports of raiders along a distant stretch of coastline, troubling, but not yet alarming. A mercenary captain mentioning rumours of unrest among certain island peoples to the west. Small things, manageable things, the kind of things that get noted in a scribe's report and then set aside, because there is always something more urgent to deal with tomorrow. But slowly, almost invisibly at first, these small things were beginning to connect. Drought in one region pushing people to move, movement creating pressure on the borders of stronger kingdoms, trade routes becoming less reliable as raiding increased along certain coastlines, grain shortages making already strained kingdoms even more desperate to protect what resources they still had. Each of these threads, on its own, was something the great powers of the Bronze Age had handled before, in one form or another. Egypt had dealt with raiders before. The Hittites had dealt with famine before. Cyprus had dealt with disruptions to trade before. What none of them had ever faced was all of these pressures arriving together, compounding each other, feeding into each other, at the exact same moment that the old diplomatic relationships that had kept the peace for generations were themselves beginning to fray under the strain. And somewhere out there, in the islands and coastlines of the Aegean and Anatolia, displaced by drought, by failed harvests, by pressures we still do not fully understand even today, groups of people who had come to be known by a name they likely never called themselves were beginning to move. Not yet as a single great migration, not yet as the catastrophic wave that would eventually wash across the entire eastern Mediterranean, just small groups at first, restless, searching, looking for somewhere new to call home, in a world that was running out of room for them to find it peacefully. The Egyptian scribes recording the events of these years had no name yet for what was coming. They simply noted, almost in passing, reports of unrest to the west, rumours of foreign ships, occasional skirmishes along the frontier. Small entries in much larger records, the kind of details that fill the margins of history before anyone realises they are about to become its centre. Far to the west of Egypt, along the dry coastline of Libya, a man named Merneptah sat on the throne his father Ramesses the Great had once ruled. Ramesses the Great, sometimes called Ramesses II, had been pharaoh for 66 years, an almost unimaginable length of time, and during his rule Egypt had reached one of the great peaks of its long history. He had built temples that still stand today, fought wars, signed that famous peace treaty with the Hittites we talked about earlier, and fathered so many children that historians still are not entirely sure of the exact number. When he finally died, an old man by the standards of any era, his son Merneptah inherited a kingdom that looked, on the surface, as strong and stable as it had ever been. But strength on the surface does not always mean strength underneath, and Merneptah was about to discover that the world his father had ruled so comfortably was beginning to shift in ways nobody fully understood yet. In the 5th year of his reign, somewhere around 1208 BC, reports began reaching the Egyptian court of a serious threat building along the western frontier. This was not entirely new territory for Egypt. Libya sat just beyond Egypt's western border, and Egyptian pharaohs had dealt with tension in that region for generations. Libyan tribes sometimes raided Egyptian settlements. Egypt sometimes pushed back into Libyan territory to assert control. It was the kind of low-level, ongoing friction that exists along almost any long-standing border between two different peoples. But what reached Merneptah's court this time was different. This was not a small raiding party. This was something much larger, an organised coalition led by a Libyan king, and joined, according to the records Merneptah's scribes would later carve into stone, by several groups of foreign warriors who had come from across the sea. This is the moment historians point to as the very first clear, dated written record of the peoples who would later be called the Sea Peoples. And I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it tells us something important. By the time Egypt is writing about them, these groups are not unknown wanderers stumbling onto the world stage for the first time. They are already organised enough, already skilled enough as soldiers, that a Libyan king actively sought them out as allies for a major military campaign against the most powerful kingdom in the region. Whoever these people were, they had already built a reputation. Someone, somewhere, knew that hiring them as mercenaries or allies was worth the cost. The inscription Merneptah eventually had carved to commemorate this campaign lists the names of the groups who fought alongside the Libyans that day. The Ekwesh, the Teresh, the Lukka, the Shurdan, the Shekelesh. 5 names carved into stone more than 3,000 years ago, names that modern historians have spent over a century trying to fully understand. Each of these groups likely came from a different homeland, possibly scattered across Anatolia, the Aegean Islands, and the central Mediterranean. They were not, as far as we can tell, a single unified nation marching under one king. They appear to have been independent groups who, for whatever reason, found common cause in this particular moment, willing to fight alongside the Libyans against Egypt. Why would they do this? This is one of the questions we still cannot answer with complete certainty, but the most likely explanation connects directly back to everything we discussed earlier about drought and food shortages spreading across the region. If these groups were already experiencing pressure on their own homelands, whether from failed harvests, population growth outpacing available farmland, or disruption to the trade networks they depended on, then joining a military campaign against wealthy, fertile Egypt would have made a certain desperate sense. Egypt had grain. Egypt had wealth. Egypt had land along the Nile that, even in difficult years, remained more productive than almost anywhere else in the region. If your own homeland was failing to feed you, and a powerful neighbouring kingdom seemed to have exactly what you needed, the logic of raiding, or even outright invasion, becomes a great deal easier to understand. The Egyptian inscriptions describe this combined force as substantial in size, and they describe something else as well. Something that adds an important layer of nuance to how we should understand this entire moment. The records mention that the invading force included not just warriors, but families. Women, children, carts loaded with belongings. This was not simply an army marching out to plunder and return home with stolen riches. This looks, in important ways, like a migration, a movement of entire communities seeking somewhere new to settle permanently. Whether the Libyan king saw an opportunity in this and recruited these displaced groups as soldiers in exchange for a share of conquered land, or whether these were simply two crises arriving in Egypt's territory at the same moment, a Libyan power struggle and an unrelated wave of displaced peoples from across the sea, we cannot say for certain. But either way, what Meneptah's army faced at the battle that followed was not a typical border skirmish. It was something larger. Something that blended traditional warfare with the desperate energy of people who had nowhere else left to go. Meneptah, to his credit, took the threat seriously, and Egypt's military responded with the kind of overwhelming force the empire was still capable of mustering at this stage of its history. The Egyptian inscriptions, as Egyptian inscriptions almost always do, describe the battle as a total and crushing victory. The pharaoh's army met the combined Libyan and foreign force somewhere near the western edge of the Nile Delta and, according to the records, inflicted devastating casualties. The inscriptions claim staggering numbers of enemy dead, thousands upon thousands, numbers that modern historians generally treat with healthy skepticism, since Egyptian pharaohs were never shy about exaggerating their own military triumphs for the sake of the historical record. But even accounting for exaggeration, it does seem clear that this was a genuine and significant Egyptian victory. The Libyan king and his foreign allies were defeated, scattered, pushed back from Egyptian territory. And here is where something fascinating happens, something that tells us a great deal about how the Egyptians themselves understood the danger they had just faced. As part of the same broader set of inscriptions commemorating this victory, Meneptah's scribes also recorded something else entirely, a separate military campaign into the region of Canaan, where Egyptian forces clashed with several local peoples and cities. Buried within this section of the inscription is a single line that has become, quite genuinely, one of the most famous and most argued over sentences in the entire field of ancient history. The line reads, in essence, that Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more. This is the very first time the name Israel appears anywhere in the written historical record, carved into an Egyptian victory monument more than 3,000 years ago, almost as an afterthought within a much longer list of conquered enemies. Historians still debate exactly what this line meant, who exactly this early Israel was at this point in history, and how it connects to the later biblical accounts of Israelite history. But for our purposes tonight, what matters most is simply this. The world Meneptah ruled over was a world already full of shifting peoples, rising and falling kingdoms, new groups forming and asserting themselves across the region, even before the larger crisis of the Sea Peoples had fully begun. Change was already in the air. Merneptah's reign simply gives us our first clearly dated written glimpse of it. After this victory, Merneptah had a large stone monument carved to commemorate his triumphs, listing the defeated enemies, celebrating the strength and stability of Egypt under his rule. And for a while, it must have genuinely seemed as though the danger had passed. Egypt had faced a serious threat, a combined force of Libyans and these strange new seafaring peoples, and Egypt had won decisively. The frontier was secure. The pharaoh's authority was unquestioned. Life along the Nile continued much as it always had. But threats like this rarely disappear simply because they have been defeated once. And in the decades that followed Merneptah's reign, Egypt itself entered a period of significant internal instability. Merneptah died, and the succession that followed was anything but smooth. Egyptian records from this period, sometimes called the end of the 19th dynasty, describe a confusing tangle of short reigns, disputed claims to the throne, and what appears to have been a genuine internal power struggle within the royal family and the priesthood. One inscription from later in this period even describes this era using the Egyptian word for chaos, suggesting that Egyptians themselves, looking back, understood these years as a time when the normal order of their society had broken down. This matters enormously for our larger story, because it means that at the exact moment when external pressures were continuing to build across the wider Mediterranean world, Egypt, one of the two great anchoring superpowers of the entire system, was distracted, weakened, and consumed by its own internal problems. A kingdom focused on solving its own succession crisis has far less capacity to monitor and respond to gathering threats beyond its borders. And while Egypt was sorting out who would sit on its throne, the pressures we discussed earlier, the drought, the displacement, the disruption of trade networks, continued building, unseen and largely unaddressed, across Anatolia, the Aegean, and the wider eastern Mediterranean. Eventually, Egypt's internal chaos resolved itself with the rise of a new dynasty, what historians call the 20th dynasty, founded by a pharaoh named Setnakte, who managed to restore order and stability to the throne after years of confusion. Setnakte's reign was relatively short, but it accomplished something crucial. It re-established a stable, unified Egyptian government just in time, as it turns out, for that government to face the single greatest external threat in Egypt's long history up to that point. Setnakte's son, who would take the throne name Rameses III, deliberately choosing a name connected to the great Rameses II, in an effort to associate himself with that earlier era of strength and stability, would be the pharaoh who faced the sea peoples at the absolute height of their power. We will spend a great deal of time with Rameses III later in this story, because what happens during his reign is, in many ways, the climax of everything we are exploring tonight. But for now, let's step back from Egypt and look at what was happening elsewhere in the Mediterranean world during these same crucial decades. Because Egypt was far from the only kingdom feeling the early tremors of the coming storm, let's turn our attention to Anatolia, to the Hittite Empire, the other great superpower of this era. We left the Hittites earlier enjoying a hard-won peace with Egypt and a position of real strength within the wider region. But that strength, as we touched on briefly before, was beginning to show real cracks by this point in our story. The grain shortages we mentioned earlier were not a brief isolated problem. They appear to have been an ongoing, worsening crisis throughout the final decades of the Hittite Empire's existence. Letters and administrative records from this period repeatedly mention food shortages, emergency grain shipments, and growing strain on the Hittite king's ability to maintain control over the many different vassal territories that made up his empire. This kind of strain creates a particular kind of danger for any large empire, and it is worth slowing down to understand exactly why. The Hittite Empire, like most ancient empires, was not a single unified nation in the way we think of countries today. It was a patchwork of vassal kingdoms and territories, each ruled by local kings or governors who answered to the Hittite king in the capital, Hattusa, but who maintained a significant degree of local independence and local military power. This system worked well during times of stability, because the central Hittite king could focus his resources and attention on the empire's most important priorities, while trusting local vassals to manage their own territories effectively. But this same system became dangerously fragile during times of crisis, because if the central government weakened, if it became distracted by famine or internal problems or external threats, local vassals had both the opportunity and, increasingly, the motivation to act independently, to pursue their own interests rather than remaining loyal to a central authority that seemed less and less able to protect or support them. And this is exactly what appears to have begun happening within the Hittite Empire during these final decades. We have evidence of growing tension and even open conflict between the Hittite king and some of his own vassal rulers. We have evidence of disputes over succession within the Hittite royal family itself, disputes that, much like what happened in Egypt, distracted the central government at precisely the moment it could least afford distraction. And we have growing evidence through both written records and archaeological findings of increasing raids and disruptions along the Hittite Empire's coastal territories, the very regions where trade routes connected the empire to the wider Mediterranean world, and the very regions most exposed to the movements of displaced peoples that we discussed in our last chapter. One particularly important piece of evidence comes from a Hittite vassal kingdom called Ugarit, the same wealthy cosmopolitan trading city we spent time exploring earlier in our story. Ugarit, remember, sat right at the crossroads of the entire Bronze Age trading world, and this position, which had made the city so wealthy during peaceful times, also made it acutely vulnerable as instability began to spread. Archaeological evidence and surviving letters show that Ugarit's king, during these final decades, was growing increasingly anxious about threats to his kingdom's security. He writes to the Hittite king, his overlord, requesting military assistance, requesting ships, requesting troops to help defend his coastline against what he describes as enemy ships, raiders coming from the sea. These early letters from Ugarit are not yet the desperate final pleas we will encounter later in our story, when the city's destruction is imminent. At this stage, they read more like the normal, recurring concerns of a wealthy coastal kingdom dealing with periodic raiding, the kind of thing that had likely happened on and off for generations along this coastline. But there is a tone, even in these earlier letters, of growing unease, a sense that the threats are becoming more frequent, more organised, harder to push back against using the kingdom's existing defences. And crucially, we have evidence that the Hittite king's response to these requests for help was often limited, sometimes simply because the Hittite military itself was stretched thin, dealing with multiple problems simultaneously across a sprawling, increasingly unstable empire. This brings us back to that pattern we identified earlier in our story, the pattern from the Amarna letters, where smaller kingdoms pleaded for help from great powers and sometimes received only silence or insufficient support in return. We see this same pattern beginning to repeat itself here, on a larger and more dangerous scale. Ugarit, a wealthy and important vassal kingdom, requesting help from its Hittite overlord, and receiving a response that, while not entirely absent, was clearly insufficient to fully address the growing threat along its coastline. Multiply this pattern across dozens of vassal kingdoms throughout the Hittite Empire, each one dealing with its own version of this same problem, each one receiving only partial support from an increasingly overstretched central government, and you begin to understand how an empire that looked powerful and stable on the surface could actually be hollowing out from within, weakening in ways that would not become fully visible until the entire structure suddenly collapsed. Meanwhile, across the Aegean Sea, in the world of Mycenaean Greece, similar pressures appear to have been building, though the evidence here comes almost entirely from archaeology rather than written records, since the Mycenaeans, unlike the Egyptians and Hittites, did not leave behind the kind of extensive royal correspondence that gives us such a detailed window into what was happening elsewhere. What archaeologists have found, however, is deeply telling. Beginning sometime in the decades before our central catastrophe, several Mycenaean palace centres show clear evidence of increased militarization. New fortification walls were built, or existing walls were significantly strengthened, at sites including Mycenae itself and the nearby fortress of Tiryns. At Mycenae, the famous Lion Gate and the massive walls surrounding the citadel, the very walls that gave rise to later Greek legends about giant builders called Cyclopes, since the stones were so massive that later Greeks could not imagine ordinary humans had built them, were constructed or expanded during exactly this period of growing instability. This kind of large-scale defensive construction tells us something important. Building walls like this requires enormous resources, enormous labour, and most importantly, it requires a government that believes, with real conviction, that a serious threat exists and that defence needs to be a top priority. Kings do not divert massive amounts of labour and stone toward building walls during times of comfortable peace and prosperity. They do this when they are afraid, when they have either experienced attacks already or have credible reason to expect them soon. Archaeologists have also found evidence at this same site of efforts to secure reliable water access from within the fortified walls themselves, elaborate underground tunnels dug down to hidden water sources, specifically designed to ensure that even during a prolonged siege, the people inside the walls would not die of thirst. This is the behaviour of a society bracing itself for serious, sustained conflict, not the behaviour of a society confident in its continued safety and prosperity. And there is something else happening within Mycenaean society during this same period that deserves our attention. Something that connects back to the systems collapse theory we discussed in our previous chapter. The Linear B records we mentioned earlier, the detailed bureaucratic tablets the Mycenaean palaces used to track everything from sheep counts to military rosters, begin to reveal, in their final years before destruction, signs of growing strain on the palace economy itself. Some tablets from this late period appear to be hastily recording emergency military preparations, including what looks like the mobilization of coastal watchers, men stationed specifically to watch for ships approaching from the sea and to send warning if hostile forces were spotted. This is direct evidence, preserved by pure chance in baked clay for over 3,000 years, that at least some Mycenaean palace centres knew, in their final months or years, that a maritime threat was approaching and were actively trying to prepare for it. We do not know with certainty whether the threat these Mycenaean watchers feared was the same broad coalition of peoples that would later attack Egypt, whether it was a more localized threat from rival Greek kingdoms or pirates, or whether, in a strange and tragic possibility that some historians take seriously, the Mycenaeans themselves were partly contributing to the very crisis spreading across the wider Mediterranean. It's worth remembering that earlier Egyptian records named a group called the Ekwesh among the forces that attacked under Meneptah, a name some historians connect to the Achaeans, an old name for the Mycenaean Greeks. It is entirely possible that as conditions worsened within Mycenaean Greece itself, whether from drought, from internal conflict between rival palace kingdoms, or from disruption to the trade networks the Mycenaean economy depended on, Some Mycenaean Greeks themselves became part of the very migrating, raiding coalition that the remaining Mycenaean palace centres were now bracing themselves to defend against. If true, this would mean the crisis spreading across the Bronze Age world was not simply a story of foreign invaders attacking peaceful settled civilizations from outside. It may have been, at least in part, a story of civilizations turning against pieces of themselves, displaced populations from within these very kingdoms becoming part of the wider wave of instability sweeping across the region. This is one of the things that makes this entire period of history so genuinely difficult to fully untangle, even after more than a century of dedicated archaeological and historical research. The lines between victim and attacker, between displaced refugee and armed raider, between internal collapse and external invasion, blur and overlap throughout this story in ways that resist simple, clean narratives. It was not, as far as the evidence suggests, a straightforward tale of barbarian hordes descending upon innocent, peaceful civilizations. It appears to have been something far more complicated, a slow unravelling that involved climate pressures, internal political instability, economic fragility, and yes, organised groups of warriors and migrants, many of whose own origins trace back to the very system that was now beginning to come apart. By the final years before the Great Collapse, the warning signs had become impossible to ignore for anyone paying close attention, even if no single kingdom yet understood the full scale of what was coming. Egypt had weathered one major attack under Meneptah and emerged victorious, but had then spent years distracted by its own internal succession crisis. The Hittite Empire was straining under the weight of recurring famine, growing tension with restless vassal states, and increasingly frequent raids along its coastal territories, raids it was finding harder and harder to fully suppress. Ugarit's king continued sending letters asking for help that arrived, when it arrived at all, in smaller quantities than the growing threat seemed to require. And in Mycenaean Greece, palace kingdoms were pouring enormous resources into walls, water tunnels and coastal watch systems, clear evidence that fear, by this point, had become a defining feature of daily life for the rulers of even the most powerful Aegean kingdoms. And yet, even with all of this, life across the Bronze Age world continued largely as it always had for most ordinary people. Farmers still planted their fields each season, hoping for better rain than the year before. Merchants still loaded ships with copper and grain and pottery, still sailed the familiar trade routes between familiar ports, even as those routes grew slightly more dangerous with each passing year. Scribes still recorded their daily transactions, their tax collections, their religious offerings, the small ordinary business of running a kingdom. Nobody living through these years woke up one morning already knowing that they were witnessing the early stages of one of the greatest catastrophes in ancient history. They simply experienced it the way people always experience history while it is happening, as a series of difficult, uncertain years, full of troubling rumours and worrying signs, but never quite tipping over, not yet, into something that felt truly irreversibly catastrophic. That tipping point, however, was coming. The pressures we have traced throughout this chapter, the drought, the displacement, the weakening of central authority within both Egypt and the Hittite Empire, the growing organisation and confidence of the very groups of peoples who would soon become known to history as the Sea Peoples, were all converging now, year by year, raid by raid, desperate letter by desperate letter, toward a moment when the slow accumulation of small crises would finally become something far larger, far faster, and far more devastating than anyone in this interconnected Bronze Age world could have fully imagined. Ugarit's king would soon write letters that were no longer simply requests for help, but desperate final warnings of cities already burning, The Hittite Empire, which had stood as one of the two great superpowers of this entire world for centuries, was about to disappear so completely and so suddenly that it would take modern archaeology more than 3,000 years to even rediscover that it had ever existed at all. Somewhere in the final years of the Hittite Empire's existence, a king sat in his palace in the mountain capital of Hattusa, watching reports arrive that grew worse with each passing season. We do not know his exact thoughts. We do not even know with complete certainty which Hittite king was the last to rule before the empire's final collapse, since the historical record from these chaotic final years is fragmentary and confused, much like the empire itself must have felt during this time. But we know enough, pieced together from scattered inscriptions, archaeological layers of destruction, and the desperate letters of neighbouring kingdoms, to understand the broad shape of what happened. And what happened was that one of the two great superpowers of the ancient world, an empire that had stood for roughly 500 years, that had fought Egypt to a standstill, that had built one of the first systems of international law and diplomacy the world had ever known, simply stopped existing. Not slowly, not through a gradual decline that future generations could clearly trace, but suddenly, catastrophically, within the span of just a few years. Let's return to Ugarit, the wealthy trading city we have followed throughout this story, because Ugarit gives us our clearest and most haunting window into exactly how this collapse felt to the people living through it. In our previous chapter, we read letters from Ugarit's king requesting help against raiders along the coast, the kind of recurring, manageable problem that wealthy coastal cities had dealt with for generations. But as we move forward into the final years before the Great Catastrophe, the tone of these letters changes completely, and the change tells us everything we need to know about how quickly this crisis accelerated. Archaeologists excavating the ruins of Ugarit discovered something extraordinary, something that almost never survives from the ancient world. They found the city's final layer of destruction frozen in time, along with clay tablets that had been baked hard, accidentally preserved by the very fires that destroyed the city. Among these tablets are letters that appear to have been written in the final days, possibly even the final hours, before Ugarit fell. One letter, written by the king of Ugarit to the king of Cyprus, describes enemy ships, 7 of them, that had already attacked and burned towns within Ugarit's own territory. The king writes that his own ships and his own troops are not at home, that they have been sent elsewhere, likely to help defend Hittite territory against threats in another direction, leaving Ugarit's own coastline dangerously undefended at the exact moment it needed protection most. This single detail tells us something crucial about how interconnected systems fail. Ugarit was a vassal of the Hittite Empire, and as a loyal vassal, it had sent its own military resources to help defend the wider empire against threats elsewhere, likely along the Hittite Empire's own coastline or its eastern borders. This would have made perfect sense during normal times, a reasonable contribution to a shared defence system that had protected everyone for generations. But these were not normal times. Threats were now emerging from multiple directions simultaneously, and the old systems of mutual defence, built for a world where dangers arrived one at a time, in ways that could be anticipated and responded to in turn, simply could not cope with threats arriving everywhere at once. Ugarit had sent help to defend the empire, and in doing so had left itself exposed precisely when its own moment of crisis arrived. There is another letter, even more haunting, written by the same king of Ugarit, though some historians debate whether it was ever actually sent, or whether it was a draft found still sitting in the palace archive, perhaps because the city fell before a messenger could carry it away. In this letter, the king writes to a foreign ruler, his ally, describing the situation in stark, urgent terms. He writes that enemy ships have been sighted at sea. he writes that the situation is dire. And in the most quoted line from this entire body of correspondence, a line that historians have returned to again and again over the past century, he writes in essence that if these reports are true, then his country has already been left to fend for itself, since his own troops and chariots remain absent, deployed elsewhere, and he begs whatever help can still be sent. We do not know exactly what happened in the days immediately following this letter. We do not have a triumphant final battle recorded, no dramatic last stand described in vivid detail, the way Egyptian pharaohs love to record their own military victories. What we have instead is silence, and then, beneath the soil, a thick layer of ash and rubble. The unmistakable archaeological signature of a city that burned and was never rebuilt. Ugarit, one of the great trading hubs of the ancient world, a city whose archives contain documents in 8 different languages, a city that had stood for centuries as a meeting point between Egypt, the Hittites, Cyprus, and the Aegean world, simply ceased to exist sometime in the early decades of the 12th century BC. It was never resettled. The wealthy cosmopolitan city that had once stood at the absolute centre of Bronze Age international trade became, within the span of what was likely just days or weeks, an abandoned ruin, its archives buried and forgotten until archaeologists rediscovered them more than 3,000 years later in the 20th century. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because there is something genuinely strange and moving about the way this particular piece of history reached us. Ugarit's final desperate messages survived not because anyone intended to preserve a record of the city's destruction for future generations, but purely by accident, because the very fires that destroyed the city also happened to bake the clay tablets hard enough to survive for thousands of years buried beneath the rubble. If those tablets had been made of papyrus instead of clay, as many records elsewhere in the ancient world were, they would have burned away to nothing, and we would have almost no direct personal voice from anyone who actually lived through this catastrophe. Instead, through pure chance, we have something remarkably intimate. The actual words of a king watching his world end, written down in the final days before it happened. And Ugarit was far from alone. As we move across the map of the Eastern Mediterranean during these same critical years, we find a pattern repeating itself again and again in city after city, kingdom after kingdom. Let's travel north now, up into the heart of Hittite territory, to the capital city itself, Hattusa. Hattusa was an enormous, heavily fortified city built into the rocky hills of central Anatolia, protected by massive walls and defended by what had been, for centuries, one of the most powerful militaries in the ancient world. And yet, sometime in the early 12th century BC, Hattusa was destroyed. Archaeologists excavating the site found clear layers of burning and destruction dating to this period. The great temples and palace complexes reduced to ash and collapsed stone. But here is where the story of Hattusa becomes especially strange, and especially revealing about the true nature of this entire collapse. When archaeologists studied the destruction layer more closely, they found something unexpected. The royal archives, the great libraries of clay tablets that should have contained the Hittite Empire's most important administrative and diplomatic records, were largely empty. Not destroyed and scattered by an attacking army, but simply absent, as though they'd been deliberately removed before the city's final destruction. This detail has led many historians to a fascinating and somewhat unsettling conclusion. It is possible that by the time Hattusa actually burned, the Hittite royal court itself had already abandoned the city, taking its most important records and treasures with it, likely fleeing toward some other location, perhaps somewhere along the southern coast of Anatolia, in a desperate attempt to preserve what remained of Hittite royal authority. If this is true, it suggests that the destruction of Hattusa we see in the archaeological record may not represent the dramatic climax of an invading army storming the gates of a defended capital, but rather something quieter and, in its own way, sadder. A capital city already weakened, already partially abandoned by its own ruling government, finally succumbing to destruction, whether at the hands of invaders, internal rebels, opportunistic raiders, or some combination of all three, after the people with the power to defend it most effectively had already given up and fled. We do not know with certainty what became of the Hittite royal family after this point. There is no triumphant return recorded anywhere. There is no later inscription describing a king who successfully restored the Hittite Empire to its former glory. The dynasty that had ruled for roughly 500 years simply disappears from the historical record entirely. One of the two great superpowers of the Bronze Age world, a kingdom that had negotiated as an equal with Egypt itself, that had built the very first peace treaty whose text survives to us today, vanishes so completely that for thousands of years afterward, almost nobody remembered the Hittites had ever existed at all. It was only in the late 19th and early 20th centuries when archaeologists began excavating sites across Turkey and slowly piecing together clay tablets written in a then unknown language, that historians rediscovered the Hittites and began to understand just how significant this lost empire had once been. Think about the scale of what that means. An entire civilization, a true superpower of its era, was so completely erased that human memory simply forgot it had existed for over 3,000 years. We did not lose small details about the Hittites. We lost the entire civilization itself, in its full enormity, until painstaking archaeological work slowly brought it back from oblivion. This is, perhaps better than anything else in our entire story tonight, the clearest illustration of just how total this collapse really was. Let's move now across the sea, back to the Aegean world, to see how this same pattern of destruction played out among the Mycenaean Greeks, the civilization we explored building up its defensive walls and water tunnels in growing fear during the final years before catastrophe struck. The destruction of the Mycenaean palace centres did not happen all at once, in a single dramatic year, the way it sometimes appears in simplified retellings of this period. Archaeological evidence suggests instead a wave of destruction unfolding across several decades, hitting different sites at slightly different times, though all within the same broad window of crisis we've been tracing throughout this story. The palace at Pylos, located along the southwestern coast of Greece, gives us a particularly vivid and well-documented example of how this destruction unfolded. Pylos was one of the major Mycenaean palace centres, ruled by a king the surviving Linear B tablets refer to by a title, meaning something close to great king or supreme ruler. Unlike Mycenae, Pylos was not built with the same massive defensive fortifications. Its palace complex was relatively open, more focused on administrative and economic functions than on military defense. This choice, whether made out of confidence, complacency, or simply different strategic priorities, would prove fatal when the crisis finally arrived at Pylos's shores. Archaeologists excavating Pylos found something remarkable, in much the same way the destruction of Ugarit accidentally preserved its final diplomatic letters. The fire that destroyed Pylos's palace also baked hard hundreds of clay tablets that would otherwise have crumbled to dust over the following centuries. These tablets, like a photograph frozen at the exact moment of catastrophe, capture the palace administration's final, frantic activities before the city fell. Several of these tablets describe what scholars believe was an emergency military mobilization, the organization of troops to specific coastal locations, almost certainly an attempt to defend against an approaching seaborne threat. Other tablets record religious offerings being made, sometimes interpreted as desperate appeals to the gods during a moment of acute crisis, offerings of unusual size or urgency compared to the palace's normal, routine religious calendar. And then, the records simply stop. The fire came, the palace burned, and unlike many other Mycenaean sites that show some evidence of at least partial resettlement or continued diminished habitation afterward, Pylos appears to have been essentially abandoned following its destruction. The sophisticated bureaucratic system that had tracked sheep counts and grain rations and military rosters for generations simply ceased to exist. Its final, most urgent records preserved only by the accident of fire-baking clay tablets that were never meant to survive more than a single growing season before being recycled or discarded. Mycenae itself, the heavily fortified palace we discussed in our previous chapter, fared somewhat differently, though ultimately the outcome would prove similarly devastating across the broader span of the Mycenaean world. Mycenae's massive walls and water tunnels appear to have provided real protection during the initial wave of crisis. Archaeological evidence suggests the site survived an initial period of destruction and continued to be inhabited in a reduced and weakened form for some additional time afterward. But this survival proved temporary. Within a few more decades, Mycenae too experienced further destruction, and the elaborate, centralized palace economy that had defined Mycenaean civilization for centuries finally collapsed entirely, even at this most heavily defended of all Mycenaean sites. Across the wider Aegean world, this same basic pattern repeats itself again and again, with local variations across dozens of archaeological sites. Palace centers burn, administrative systems collapse, the sophisticated bureaucracy of linear B record keeping disappears so completely that writing itself seems to vanish from mainland Greece for centuries afterward. This is worth pausing on because it represents an almost unimaginable loss. The Mycenaean Greeks had developed a functional writing system capable of recording complex administrative, economic and religious information. After this collapse, that writing system disappears entirely. When the Greeks eventually develop writing again, centuries later, they do so using an entirely different system, an alphabet borrowed and adapted from Phoenician traders, completely unrelated to the earlier Linear B script. The Greeks who lived during the centuries immediately following this collapse, the period historians often call the Greek Dark Age, were, in a very real sense, illiterate descendants of a literate civilization, having lost not just political stability, but an entire technology of memory and record-keeping that their ancestors had possessed. Now, with this picture of widespread, simultaneous destruction firmly in mind, spreading from Ugarit on the Syrian coast, through the Hittite capital deep in the Anatolian highlands, across the palace centres of Mycenaean Greece, it becomes worth asking the question that historians have wrestled with for over a century now. What exactly caused all of this? And the honest answer, the answer most serious historians and archaeologists have settled on after generations of research and debate, is that no single cause fully explains everything we have just described. This is where the systems collapse theory we touched on briefly in our first chapter together becomes so important to understand fully. Let's walk through the major theories one at a time, because each one captures a piece of the truth, even though none of them alone captures the whole picture. The first and most famous theory, the one that gives this entire historical period its popular name, points directly to the Sea Peoples themselves as the primary cause of the collapse. This theory draws heavily on the Egyptian inscriptions we have been discussing throughout our story, inscriptions that explicitly describe coalitions of foreign warriors attacking and destroying kingdoms throughout the region. There is genuine archaeological support for parts of this theory as well. Some destruction layers at certain sites do show evidence consistent with violent attack. Weapons. Arrowheads embedded in walls, skeletal remains showing signs of violent death. The movement of distinctive pottery styles and certain types of weapons and armour across the region during this period also suggests genuine movement of peoples, possibly displaced populations or armed groups, travelling and settling in new territories during exactly this window of crisis. But this theory alone struggles to fully explain everything we see in the historical and archaeological record. If the Sea Peoples alone were responsible for this entire collapse, we would expect to see more consistent evidence of their direct involvement at every single destroyed site. Instead, the evidence is often more ambiguous. Some destroyed sites show clear signs of violent attack. Others, like Hattusa with its emptied archives, suggest something closer to abandonment or internal collapse, rather than direct conquest. This inconsistency suggests that whatever the Sea Peoples were doing during this period, and they were clearly doing something significant, since Egyptian records describe direct conflict with them in considerable detail. They were likely not the sole cause of every destruction event across this enormous geographic region. The second major theory focuses on climate change and the drought conditions we discussed at length in our very first chapter together. Modern scientific research, drawing on pollen analysis, sediment cores, and other forms of environmental evidence, has increasingly supported the idea that the Eastern Mediterranean experienced a genuine, significant period of drought and climate disruption during exactly this window of history. This theory helps explain something the Sea Peoples theory alone cannot fully account for: the apparent displacement and migration of large populations, the very people who would go on to become identified as Sea Peoples themselves in Egyptian records. If drought was making farmland increasingly unproductive across Anatolia and the Aegean, it would create exactly the kind of pressure that pushes communities to migrate in search of better conditions elsewhere, sometimes peacefully, sometimes through raiding and conquest when peaceful options were not available. The third theory points to a wave of major earthquakes that struck the Eastern Mediterranean during roughly this same period. This might sound like an unusual factor to include alongside drought and invasion, but the evidence for it is genuinely significant. Archaeologists studying several of the destroyed sites we've discussed tonight have found physical evidence consistent with earthquake damage, toppled walls in patterns that suggest seismic activity rather than deliberate destruction by attacking armies, and the geographic region in question sits along significant fault lines that remain seismically active even today. Some historians have proposed what they call an earthquake storm theory, the idea that a series of major earthquakes struck the region in relatively close succession during this period, each one further weakening already strained kingdoms, damaging fortifications, disrupting cities, and creating exactly the kind of chaos and vulnerability that would make these same kingdoms far less able to defend themselves against other threats arriving at the same time, whether from invaders, internal rebellion, or simple economic collapse. The fourth theory, and this one connects most directly back to the diplomatic and economic fragility we explored so carefully in our first chapter, focuses on the simple but devastating impact of trade network collapse. Remember how completely interconnected this Bronze Age world had become, how every kingdom depended on copper and tin flowing along established trade routes to maintain its military strength, how the Hittite Empire depended on grain imports just to feed its own population. If raiding along coastal trade routes increased, even moderately, even without full-scale invasion and conquest, it could be enough to seriously disrupt the flow of these critical resources. A kingdom that suddenly cannot get enough tin to properly arm its soldiers becomes a kingdom that is suddenly far more vulnerable to any other threat it faces, whether from external raiders or internal rebellion. This theory suggests that the collapse may have been, in significant part, an economic catastrophe as much as a military one, a complex specialized trading system that, once seriously disrupted in just a few key locations, could no longer support the elaborate interdependent civilizations that had been built on top of it. And finally, there is the theory of internal rebellion and social collapse. The idea that at least some of the destruction we see during this period may have come not from external invaders at all, but from internal uprisings, ordinary people within these kingdoms rising up against rulers and palace systems that had become increasingly unable to protect them or provide for their basic needs during a period of mounting crisis. This theory is harder to prove directly through archaeological evidence alone, but it fits naturally alongside everything else we have discussed. A population already suffering from drought, already anxious about raiders along the coast, already watching their kings struggle to maintain order and provide adequate defence, might well reach a breaking point, rising up against the very palace system that had failed to protect them, even as external threats were simultaneously bearing down from elsewhere. The truth, as best as modern historians and archaeologists can reconstruct it after more than a century of careful research, is almost certainly some combination of all 5 of these factors, arriving together, compounding each other, in a way that no single Bronze Age kingdom, however powerful, however well organized, could fully withstand. Drought weakened agricultural production and pushed populations to migrate. Migration created new groups of displaced, often armed and increasingly desperate people, some of whom would eventually become identified by the Egyptians as sea peoples. Earthquakes physically damaged cities and fortifications at exactly the wrong moment, while simultaneously straining the resources kingdoms needed to rebuild and recover. Disrupted trade routes, whether from raiding, general instability, or simple breakdown of the cooperative diplomatic relationships that had sustained them, deprived kingdoms of the copper, tin and grain they desperately needed to maintain both their militaries and their basic food supplies, and weakened increasingly desperate populations, watching their rulers fail to provide either security or basic sustenance, grew more willing to rebel, to abandon loyalty to a system that no longer seemed capable of protecting them. This is what systems collapse really means, and it is worth sitting with this idea for a moment longer, because it offers something genuinely important for understanding not just this ancient catastrophe, but the fragility of complex, interconnected systems more generally. A system built on deep specialization and interdependence, where every part relies heavily on every other part functioning correctly, can be remarkably efficient and prosperous during stable times. But that same specialization and interdependence becomes a profound vulnerability when multiple serious shocks arrive simultaneously. The Bronze Age Mediterranean world had spent centuries building exactly this kind of efficient, prosperous, deeply interconnected system. And when drought, earthquakes, trade disruption, migration, and internal unrest all arrived together within the span of just a few decades, that same intricate, beautiful interdependence became the very mechanism through which collapse spread so quickly and so completely from one kingdom to the next. By the time the dust settled, sometime in the early decades of the 12th century BC, the map of the Eastern Mediterranean world had been redrawn almost beyond recognition. The Hittite Empire, one of 2 great superpowers, had vanished so completely it would be forgotten for thousands of years. Ugarit, the great cosmopolitan trading hub, lay abandoned and buried, its final desperate letters frozen in baked clay beneath the rubble. The palace centres of Mycenaean Greece lay in ruins, their sophisticated writing system lost, plunging the Greek world into a centuries-long dark age from which it would only slowly recover. Trade routes that had connected the entire region for centuries had been severely disrupted or broken entirely. The interconnected, prosperous world we explored so carefully in our very first chapter together, the world of royal brothers writing letters to each other across vast distances, of Cypriot copper flowing into Hittite forges, of Mycenaean pottery found in Egyptian tombs, had largely ceased to exist. And yet, remarkably, one great power of this Bronze Age world still remained standing, battered, weakened, but not yet destroyed. Egypt, under its new pharaoh Ramesses III, was about to face the full, concentrated force of this same crisis, as the surviving remnants of the displaced peoples who had brought down empire after empire across the region finally turned their attention toward the wealthy, fertile land along the Nile, the one great prize that had, so far, managed to avoid the catastrophic destruction sweeping across the rest of the Bronze Age world. Ramesses III had inherited a throne his father Setnakti had only just managed to stabilize, and he had inherited it at, quite possibly, the single most dangerous moment in Egypt's already long and eventful history. By the time he took the throne, sometime around 1186 BC, the world we spent our first chapter exploring in such loving detail, the interconnected, prosperous Bronze Age system of trading partners and diplomatic brothers, had already largely ceased to exist beyond Egypt's own borders. The Hittite Empire was gone. Ugarit was ash. The Mycenaean palace centres lay in ruins. Egypt now stood almost entirely alone, the last great surviving power of an entire civilization that had once stretched across the eastern Mediterranean. And the people responsible for so much of that destruction, the very groups we have been calling the Sea Peoples throughout our story tonight, were now turning their full attention toward Egypt itself. We need to understand something important about why this happened, because it tells us a great deal about the true nature of the crisis these displaced peoples were experiencing. By the time they reached Egypt's borders, the lands these groups had likely come from, whether in Anatolia, the Aegean, or elsewhere across the eastern Mediterranean, had already been ravaged by the same drought, the same trade disruption, the same political collapse we traced so carefully in our previous chapter. There was, quite simply, less and less left to sustain them anywhere else in the region. Egypt, meanwhile, still had the Nile. Egypt still had reliable flooding, still had productive farmland, still had granaries full of stored grain, still had wealth accumulated over more than 1,000 years of relative stability. Populations who had watched kingdom after kingdom collapse around them, who had perhaps already fled their own homelands once or even multiple times in search of somewhere stable to settle, Egypt must have appeared as something close to the last viable destination left in the entire region. The Nile Delta did not just represent another target for raiding. It represented, quite possibly, the last truly fertile, stable land remaining anywhere within reach. This is, I think, one of the most important things to understand about what Ramesses III actually faced. This was not simply another military campaign against a foreign army seeking plunder and then planning to return home. The Egyptian inscriptions describing this invasion, much like the earlier inscriptions from Meneptah's reign that we discussed in our second chapter together, describe the invading force as including entire families, women, children, ox carts loaded with household belongings. This was, in very real and important ways, a mass migration, an entire displaced population searching for somewhere new and stable to live, arriving at the one place in the entire region that still seemed to offer that stability. Whether we think of the people Ramesses faced primarily as invaders or primarily as refugees likely depends on which moment of their journey we are looking at, and the honest truth is probably that they were both, simultaneously, in ways that resist simple categorization. Our primary source for understanding this enormous confrontation comes from an extraordinary set of inscriptions and relief carvings at a site called Medinet Habu on the west bank of the Nile near modern Luxor. Ramesses III built an enormous mortuary temple here, and he covered its walls with detailed carvings and lengthy hieroglyphic texts describing his military victories, including, most famously, his confrontations with this coalition of sea peoples. These carvings represent, by a significant margin, our single richest source of detailed information about who these peoples were, what they looked like, how they fought, and how Egypt eventually managed to defeat them. Without Medinet Habu, our understanding of the sea peoples would be considerably thinner and more fragmentary than it already is. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu name several groups as part of this final climactic coalition that attacked Egypt during Ramesses III's reign, and importantly, this list differs somewhat from the groups named decades earlier under Meneptah. We see some familiar names return, including the Shurdan and the Checker, but we also see new names appear for the first time, most significantly the Peliset, the Denyen and the Weshish. This shift in named groups across the decades tells us something important. The crisis was not static, it was evolving, with different populations becoming involved or growing more prominent as the wider catastrophe across the Bronze Age world continued unfolding over these critical years. The Peliset deserve particular attention here, because their story extends far beyond this single moment of conflict with Egypt, reaching forward into history in a way that connects directly to names and places many people today would recognize immediately, even if they have never heard the term Sea Peoples before. Most historians believe the Peliset are the same people who would, in the years and decades following their conflict with Egypt, settle along the coast of Canaan, in the region we today call the Gaza Strip, and the surrounding coastal areas of modern Israel and Palestine. There they would establish a series of city-states, and history would come to know them by a different, more familiar name. The Philistines. This is genuinely one of the most fascinating threads running through this entire story. The biblical Philistines, the people described in later Hebrew scripture as recurring rivals and enemies of the early Israelites, the people associated with figures like the giant warrior Goliath, appear to be direct descendants, or perhaps even the very same generation, as the Peliset who fought against Ramesses III at the height of the Sea Peoples crisis. A group of displaced migrating peoples, quite possibly originally from somewhere in the Aegean world, based on certain similarities in pottery styles and material culture that archaeologists have identified, were defeated by Egypt, but were not destroyed. Instead, they settled along the coast of Canaan, in what was, at that point, weakened Egyptian-controlled territory, and over the following generations they built a new civilization there, one that would go on to leave a lasting mark on history through its long, complicated relationship with the early Israelites, a relationship recorded in some of the most widely read religious texts in human history. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let's return to the actual confrontation between Ramesses III and this coalition of sea peoples, because the Egyptian inscriptions describe not one battle, but two, fought in two very different ways, against two different aspects of the same overall threat. The first major confrontation, sometime around year 5 of Ramesses III's reign, was fought primarily on land against a renewed threat from Libyan forces along Egypt's western frontier, echoing the earlier conflict Meneptah had faced decades before. The Egyptian inscriptions describe this as another significant victory, with Ramesses personally leading Egyptian forces against the Libyan coalition and successfully driving them back from Egyptian territory. This victory brought Egypt crucial time and stability, but it was only the opening movement of a much larger crisis still building elsewhere. The truly decisive confrontation came a few years later, around year 8 of Ramesses III's reign, and this is the battle that has become, by a considerable margin, the most famous and most extensively documented encounter between Egypt and the Sea People's Coalition. The Medinet Habu inscriptions describe this as a combined assault, the Sea People's Coalition advancing both by land and by sea simultaneously, having apparently already destroyed or passed through other territories along the eastern Mediterranean coast on their way toward Egypt's borders. The inscriptions specifically mention that this coalition had already overwhelmed several other lands before reaching Egypt, a detail that aligns perfectly with everything we explored in our previous chapter about the wider collapse already underway across the Hittite Empire, the Levant, and the broader eastern Mediterranean world. The land battle, sometimes called the Battle of Jahi, took place somewhere along Egypt's northeastern frontier, likely in the region of southern Canaan, as Egyptian forces moved to intercept the coalition before it could reach the Nile Delta itself. The inscriptions describe Ramesses personally directing Egyptian forces, organising his army to meet the invading coalition before they could establish themselves on Egyptian soil. While the inscriptions, in typical Egyptian fashion, claim an overwhelming Egyptian victory, the very fact that this battle needed to be fought at all, that an organised, capable coalition was advancing far enough to threaten Egyptian-controlled territory directly, tells us just how serious this threat genuinely was. But it is the second engagement, the naval battle that followed, that has captured the imagination of historians and the public alike for generations, and for very good reason. Because the way Egypt won this battle reveals something genuinely clever and historically significant about ancient naval warfare. The Medinet Habu reliefs include an extraordinarily detailed depiction of this naval engagement, often called the Battle of the Delta, and it remains one of the very earliest detailed depictions of naval combat anywhere in the historical record. The carvings show Egyptian ships engaging enemy vessels within the mouth of one of the branches of the Nile River, rather than out in the open sea. This detail matters enormously, and it reveals the strategic thinking Ramesses III and his military commanders employed to overcome what was, in many ways, a genuinely difficult tactical problem. Egypt, historically, had not been a major naval power in the same way some of its neighbours were. Egyptian military strength had traditionally rested on its army, on chariots and infantry fighting across the relatively flat, open terrain of the Nile Valley and the surrounding regions. The Sea People's Coalition, by contrast, included groups who were, almost by definition, experienced seafarers, peoples who had been sailing and raiding across the Mediterranean for years, who had likely developed considerable skill and experience in ship-to-ship combat during their long journey across the collapsing Bronze Age world. In a direct naval confrontation out on the open sea, fighting on terms the Sea Peoples themselves were most comfortable with, Egypt's relative inexperience as a naval power could have proven disastrous. So instead, Ramesses III made a decision that shows real strategic intelligence. Rather than meeting the enemy fleet out at sea, he allowed, or perhaps deliberately lured, the Sea People's ships into the narrower waters at the mouth of the Nile itself. This was Egyptian home territory in every sense, waters Egyptian sailors knew intimately, waters where the narrower confines limited the enemy's ability to manoeuvre freely and use whatever superior seamanship they may have possessed out on the open ocean. The Medinet Habu reliefs show Egyptian archers positioned both on ships and along the riverbanks themselves, raining arrows down onto the enemy vessels as they became trapped within this narrower, more controllable battle space. The carvings depict enemy ships capsizing, enemy warriors being pulled from the water, a scene of chaotic, decisive Egyptian victory. There is also evidence, both from the visual reliefs and from analysis of the ship designs depicted, that Egyptian vessels in this battle may have been specifically modified or reinforced for this kind of combat, potentially including stronger hulls designed to ram and disable enemy ships, a tactic that, if accurately depicted, would represent a genuinely innovative piece of ancient naval engineering developed specifically in response to this unprecedented threat. Whether Ramesses III personally devised this strategy, or whether it emerged from his military commanders working through the problem together, the underlying lesson remains the same. Faced with an enemy whose strengths lay in open water combat, Egypt won not by meeting that strength directly, but by changing the terms of the battle entirely, forcing the engagement to happen on Egypt's terms, in Egyptian territory, using Egyptian knowledge of the local terrain to neutralize whatever advantages the Sea People's coalition might otherwise have possessed. The combined result of these land and naval victories was, by any reasonable historical measure, a genuine and significant Egyptian triumph. Where the Hittite Empire had vanished entirely, where Ugarit had burned and been abandoned, where the Mycenaean palace centres lay in ruins, Egypt had stood, fought, and won. The Nile Delta had not fallen, the pharaoh's authority had not collapsed. Egyptian civilization, unlike so much of the rest of the Bronze Age world we have explored throughout this story, would continue, its temple still standing, its administrative system still functioning, its long unbroken chain of pharaonic rule still intact. And yet I want to be very careful here, because there is an important and somewhat sobering truth sitting just beneath the surface of this victory, one that the triumphant Egyptian inscriptions at Medinet Habu naturally do not emphasize, but which modern historians, looking at the broader sweep of evidence across Ramesses III's reign and the decades that followed, have come to understand quite clearly. Egypt won this war. But Egypt did not win it cheaply, and Egypt would never again be the same overwhelming superpower it had been before this crisis began. Consider what this victory actually cost. Even a successful defensive war against a major invading coalition requires enormous resources, mobilizing large numbers of soldiers, sailors, and chariots, feeding and equipping them, sustaining military operations across an extended campaign. Egypt had to do all of this at precisely the same moment that the wider Bronze Age trading network, the network that had once brought tin and other valuable resources flowing into Egypt from across the Mediterranean world, was collapsing entirely. The old trading partners were gone. The Hittites, who Egypt had once depended on for various trade goods, and with whom Egypt maintained important diplomatic relationships, no longer existed at all. Cyprus, the great source of copper that had fed bronze production across the entire region for centuries, had itself been significantly disrupted during this same period of crisis, with several major Cypriot sites showing their own evidence of destruction and disruption during these chaotic decades. We also have direct evidence, from records surviving later in Ramesses III's own reign, of serious internal economic strain within Egypt itself during this same period. Perhaps the most famous and striking piece of evidence comes from records of what historians believe was the very first recorded labour strike in human history. Workers at the royal necropolis near Thebes, the skilled craftsmen responsible for building and decorating the elaborate tombs of the pharaohs and Egyptian nobility, organised a work stoppage because their grain rations. The payment they received for their labour had not been delivered on time. This was an extraordinarily significant moment, not just as a historical curiosity, but as direct evidence of genuine strain within Egypt's own internal economic and administrative systems, strain that aligns perfectly with everything we have discussed about disrupted trade. The enormous costs of fighting off the Sea People's invasion, and the broader pressures affecting the entire Mediterranean world during this period. This detail matters enormously for understanding the true legacy of Ramesses III's victory. Egypt had successfully defended itself against the very crisis that had destroyed the Hittite Empire and devastated the Mycenaean world. But the cost of that defence, combined with the broader collapse of the international trading and diplomatic system Egypt had depended on for centuries, left Egypt itself significantly weakened, even in victory. The Egypt that emerged from this crisis, while still standing, while still ruled by a pharaoh, while still maintaining its core civilization and culture, was not the same confident. Internationally connected superpower we explored in our very first chapter together. It was a wounded survivor, one that had narrowly avoided the complete catastrophe that had befallen so much of the rest of the Bronze Age world, but a survivor nonetheless, carrying real and lasting scars from the conflict. Ramesses III's own reign would eventually end in tragedy of an entirely different and more personal kind. Historical and even some forensic evidence, including modern analysis of his mummified remains, suggests that he was the victim of an assassination plot organised within his own royal court, apparently involving one of his secondary wives attempting to place her own son on the throne instead of the legitimate heir. This palace conspiracy, sometimes called the Harem conspiracy based on surviving court records describing the resulting trial and punishments, represents its own dramatic and separate story, one we could certainly explore in much greater detail on another night. But for our purposes here, it serves as one more small piece of evidence pointing toward a kingdom under genuine accumulated strain, where even the royal palace itself, the very centre of pharaonic power and stability, had become a place of dangerous internal conflict and competing ambitions, even in the years immediately following Egypt's celebrated military triumph over the Sea Peoples. In the decades following Ramesses III's reign, Egypt entered a long, slow period of gradual decline. This decline was not sudden or catastrophic in the way the Hittite Empire's collapse had been. Egypt did not simply vanish from history the way the Hittites had. Egyptian civilization, remarkably, would continue for many more centuries through numerous additional dynasties, eventually outlasting nearly every other Bronze Age power we have discussed throughout this story. But the era of Egypt as the unquestioned dominant superpower of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Egypt of Ramesses the Great, negotiating as an equal with a thriving Hittite Empire, receiving tribute and maintaining military garrisons across vast stretches of foreign territory. That particular version of Egyptian greatness had effectively come to an end. Later pharaohs would struggle increasingly with internal political fragmentation, with the growing independent power of the priesthood, with foreign invasions and occupations by other emerging powers in the centuries that followed. Egypt's long, slow afternoon had begun, even though its final sunset remained still many centuries away. Meanwhile, the remnants of the Sea People's coalition, those who had survived their defeat at the hands of Ramesses III, scattered across the region in the aftermath of this great confrontation, did not simply disappear. We have already discussed how the Pelasets settled along the Canaanite coast and became, in time, the Philistines. Other groups likely settled in various locations across the eastern Mediterranean as well, including, many historians believe, parts of Cyprus, where significant cultural changes appear in the archaeological record during exactly this period, suggesting new populations arriving and establishing themselves on the island in the wake of the wider Bronze Age collapse. This is perhaps one of the most important and easily overlooked aspects of this entire story. The Sea Peoples, whoever they ultimately were, whatever their true origins, did not function purely as agents of destruction, sweeping through the ancient world and then vanishing back into historical obscurity, once their work of devastation was complete. They were also simultaneously founders, displaced peoples searching for new homes, who, having failed to settle within Egypt itself, the one great power capable of successfully resisting them, instead established new settlements and new societies elsewhere across the region, becoming in time the ancestors of new peoples and new civilizations that would help shape the next chapter of Mediterranean history. The Bronze Age world that we explored together in such loving, careful detail back in our first chapter, the interconnected web of trading partners and diplomatic brothers, of Mycenaean palaces and Hittite treaties and Cypriot copper flowing into forges across the entire region, was now, by the end of Ramesses III's reign, almost entirely gone. Egypt remained, wounded but standing, the last great survivor of an entire vanished world, and across the rest of the eastern Mediterranean, in the ashes and ruins left behind by this enormous multi-decade catastrophe, something new was already, quietly, beginning to take shape, even as the full scale of everything that had been lost was only just beginning to become clear to those who had survived to see what remained. In the years and decades following the great confrontation between Egypt and the Sea Peoples Coalition, the world that emerged across the eastern Mediterranean would have been almost unrecognizable to someone who remembered, even faintly, the prosperous, interconnected civilization we explored together in our very first chapter. The contrast is genuinely difficult to overstate, and tonight, in this final part of our journey together, we are going to walk slowly through exactly what was lost, how deep and how long-lasting that loss truly was, and then, just as importantly, what eventually grew up from the ashes of that lost world. Because this story, even though it begins in catastrophe, does not end there. Let's start by taking stock of the full scale of what had actually happened across this remarkable, devastating period of history, sometimes called, quite simply, the Late Bronze Age collapse. This term itself, used by modern historians, captures something important. This was not simply a difficult few decades for one or two unlucky kingdoms. This was a near total collapse of an entire interconnected civilizational system, spanning the eastern Mediterranean from Greece in the west to Mesopotamia in the east, touching nearly every major power we discussed throughout our story tonight. The Hittite Empire, one of the two true superpowers of this entire world, had vanished so completely that, as we discussed in detail, human memory simply forgot it had ever existed for well over 3,000 years. Ugarit, the great cosmopolitan trading hub where merchants from a dozen different cultures had once gathered, lay buried and abandoned, its final desperate letters frozen forever in baked clay beneath the rubble of its own destruction. The Mycenaean palace centres across Greece, Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns and others, lay in ruins, their sophisticated bureaucratic systems and their written language completely lost, plunging the entire Greek world into a period of darkness, isolation and illiteracy that would last for centuries. Cyprus, the great source of copper that had once fed bronze production across the entire region, had been significantly disrupted as well, with several major sites showing clear evidence of destruction and disruption during this same chaotic window of history. Even Egypt, the one great power that had managed to survive and successfully defend itself, emerged from this crisis profoundly weakened, its golden age effectively at its end, even though Egyptian civilization itself would continue for many more centuries afterward. It is worth pausing here to really sit with the scale of this collapse, because in the long sweep of human history, genuine civilizational collapses on this scale are actually quite rare. We are not talking about a single empire falling while its neighbours continue largely unaffected, the way empires have risen and fallen throughout history many times before and since. we are talking about an entire interconnected regional system, one that had taken centuries to build, one that had produced extraordinary wealth, sophisticated diplomacy, advanced administrative bureaucracies, and genuine cultural achievement across multiple civilizations simultaneously, essentially collapsing within the span of just a few decades. Historians sometimes compare the scale of this collapse to imagining, in our own modern world, the simultaneous and near-total collapse of several major world powers all within the same generation, along with the disappearance of international trade, advanced technology, and even written language across large portions of the globe. It is, genuinely, one of the most dramatic and total civilizational collapses in all of recorded human history, and the aftermath, the period immediately following this collapse, is often described by historians using a particularly evocative term: the Dark Age. We have already touched on this briefly when discussing Greece specifically, but it is worth exploring this idea more fully now, because the darkness that followed this collapse extended across multiple regions, lasting in various forms for centuries. In Greece, the period following the Mycenaean collapse, often called the Greek Dark Age, lasted for roughly 3 to 4 centuries. During this extended period, the population of mainland Greece appears to have declined significantly, based on archaeological evidence showing far fewer and far smaller settlements compared to the Mycenaean period that preceded it. The complex, centralized palace economies that had once organized and recorded nearly every aspect of economic and social life simply disappeared, replaced by smaller, more scattered, and far less sophisticated communities. Monumental architecture, the kind of massive stone construction the Mycenaeans had been capable of, building walls so impressive that later Greeks attributed them to mythical giants, largely ceased. And writing itself, as we discussed, vanished entirely. The Linear B script, once used to track sheep counts and military rosters across an empire of interconnected palace kingdoms, was completely forgotten. When the Greeks eventually rediscovered writing, centuries later during what historians call the Greek Archaic period, they did so by adapting an entirely different writing system, an alphabet borrowed from Phoenician traders, completely unrelated to the earlier script their own ancestors had once used and then lost entirely. Think about what this actually means for the people living through these centuries. Generations of Greeks lived and died during this Dark Age without any written language at all, without any direct written connection to the sophisticated, wealthy civilization their distant ancestors had once built. The great stories that would eventually emerge from this period, and the centuries that followed, including the legendary tales of the Trojan War that would eventually be written down by Homer centuries later, were preserved not through writing, since writing itself had been lost, but purely through oral tradition, stories passed down by memory alone, from one generation of storytellers to the next, slowly transforming and evolving with each retelling, until they were finally written down again, centuries after the events they described, in an entirely new writing system, by a civilization that had only recently rediscovered literacy itself. This is, I think, one of the most genuinely moving aspects of this entire story. The epic poems of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, stories that remain among the most influential and widely studied works of literature in all of human history, are, in a very real sense, distant echoes of the very Bronze Age world we explored together in our first chapter. The world of Mycenaean warrior kings and fortified palaces, preserved across centuries of darkness purely through the fragile, remarkable human capacity for oral storytelling, until a literate Greek civilization finally emerged on the other side of that long dark age and wrote these ancient memories down for the very first time. Similar patterns of decline and disruption appear across much of Anatolia and the wider Levant during these same centuries. The sophisticated, centralized administrative systems that had characterized the Hittite Empire disappeared entirely. Some smaller successor states did eventually emerge in parts of southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria, sometimes called Neo-Hittite states by modern historians, kingdoms that preserved fragments of Hittite culture, religion, and even some elements of their writing system. But these successor states were considerably smaller and less powerful than the great unified empire that had once dominated the region. The grand age of Hittite imperial power was gone permanently, replaced by a more fragmented, regionally divided political landscape that would persist for generations. Trade networks across the entire region took generations to rebuild, and even when international trade did eventually resume, it never quite returned to the same scale or sophistication that had characterized the Bronze Age world at its height. The elaborate system of royal gift exchange and diplomatic correspondence between great power brothers, the kind of relationship we saw documented in the Amarna letters between Egypt and the Hittites, simply had no equivalent in the centuries that followed, largely because the great, evenly matched superpowers that had once made that kind of relationship possible no longer existed in the same way. And yet, even as we sit with the genuine scale of everything that was lost during this remarkable period of history, it is important, as we bring our story to a close tonight, to understand that collapse and darkness were not the only outcomes of this enormous, multi-decade catastrophe. Something else was happening as well, something that becomes clearer the further forward in time we move from the depths of this dark age. New civilizations, new peoples, and new ways of organizing society were beginning to emerge from the wreckage of the old Bronze Age world. And in some genuinely important ways, the very collapse that destroyed so much also cleared space for entirely new forms of civilization to develop and eventually flourish. Let's start with one of the most significant of these emerging peoples, a group we have actually already met briefly earlier in our story. The Phoenicians. The Phoenicians emerged along the coast of the eastern Mediterranean, in the region of modern-day Lebanon, in cities that included Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos. Some of these cities had existed even before the Great Collapse, but it was in the centuries following the catastrophe that Phoenician civilization truly began to flourish and expand outward across the wider Mediterranean world. With many of the old Bronze Age superpowers gone or severely weakened, with the old trading networks disrupted and waiting to be rebuilt, the Phoenicians found themselves remarkably well positioned to fill this vacuum. They became, over the following centuries, the great maritime traders and seafarers of the ancient world, establishing trading colonies and settlements across the Mediterranean, including, most famously, the city of Carthage on the coast of North Africa. A city that would eventually grow into a major power in its own right, one whose later wars with Rome would shape the course of Mediterranean history for centuries to come. Perhaps the single most significant and lasting Phoenician contribution to world history, however, was their development and spread of an alphabet, a simplified system of writing using a relatively small number of symbols to represent the basic sounds of human speech, rather than the complex systems of hundreds or even thousands of symbols that earlier writing systems like Egyptian hieroglyphics or Mesopotamian cuneiform had required. This Phoenician alphabet spread across the Mediterranean world during these centuries following the Bronze Age collapse, and it would eventually be adapted by the Greeks, as we discussed just a few minutes ago, becoming the foundation for the Greek alphabet, which would later be adapted again by the Romans, eventually becoming. After many more centuries of gradual evolution, the very alphabet many of you listening tonight are reading these words in right now, if you happen to be following along with captions as you drift off to sleep. There is something genuinely remarkable in that connection, a direct, traceable line running from a relatively obscure group of seafaring traders, emerging from the wreckage of a catastrophic civilizational collapse more than 3,000 years ago, all the way forward to the written language so many of us use every single day in the modern world, without ever stopping to think about just how far back its origins truly reach. We have already discussed the Philistines as well, the people most historians believe descended from the Peliset, one of the groups within the Sea Peoples coalition that fought against Ramesses III. Settling along the coast of Canaan in the wake of their defeat by Egypt, the Philistines established a series of independent city-states, including Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ashdod, cities whose names remain significant and recognizable even today. Over the following centuries, the Philistines developed their own distinct culture, blending elements that archaeologists believe trace back to their likely Aegean origins, with influences absorbed from the local Canaanite populations they settled among. Their long, complicated, often violent relationship with the emerging Israelite kingdoms to the east, a relationship extensively documented in the Hebrew Bible, would become one of the defining narratives of this entire region's history for centuries to come, eventually influencing religious and cultural traditions that remain significant to billions of people across the modern world. Speaking of the Israelites, this brings us to another remarkable thread connecting the chaos of the Bronze Age collapse to the world that emerged afterward. We touched briefly, back in our second chapter together, on that famous line from Meneptah's inscription, the very first historical reference to Israel anywhere in the written record, describing it somewhat ominously as already laid waste. Yet in the centuries following the broader Bronze Age collapse, as the old centralized empires that had once dominated the region disappeared or weakened significantly, smaller kingdoms and peoples throughout the Levant, including the early Israelites, found new space and opportunity to grow, organize, and eventually establish their own independent kingdoms. The biblical accounts of figures like King David and King Solomon, even setting aside ongoing scholarly debates about the precise historical accuracy of every detail in these accounts, describe a period of growing Israelite political organization and kingdom building that took place during exactly this post-collapse era, a time when the absence of the old dominant superpowers. Egypt significantly weakened, the Hittites gone entirely, created genuine space for smaller, previously overshadowed peoples to step forward and build something new and lasting of their own. This is, I think, one of the most genuinely fascinating patterns running throughout this entire story, and it is worth slowing down to really appreciate it as we bring our journey tonight to its close. Throughout human history, again and again, we see this same basic pattern repeating itself. Periods of dramatic collapse and destruction. Periods that feel, to the people actually living through them, like nothing less than the complete and total end of their entire world, often turn out, when we look back across the much longer span of history, to also be periods of genuine transformation and renewal. The old, rigid, highly centralized Bronze Age system, with its handful of enormous palace-based superpowers controlling vast territories and tightly managing trade and diplomacy between themselves, gave way through tremendous suffering and loss to a very different kind of world. A world with more numerous, smaller, more diverse kingdoms and peoples. A world that would eventually give rise to entirely new political ideas, including, many centuries later, the very different model of Greek city-states governing themselves, in some remarkable cases, through early forms of democratic participation that had no real equivalent anywhere in the earlier Bronze Age palace economies we explored together in our first chapter tonight. The Iron Age, the period that gradually emerged following this long, difficult transition out of the Bronze Age collapse, takes its name from a significant and lasting technological shift that occurred during exactly these chaotic, transformative centuries. remember how heavily the entire Bronze Age system had depended on bronze for weapons and tools, and remember how that dependence required reliable access to both copper and tin, with tin in particular requiring long-distance trade routes that, as we discussed extensively in our third chapter, became severely disrupted during the Great Collapse. With these long-distance tin trading routes broken, societies across the region increasingly turned toward a different metal for their tools and weapons. Iron ore, unlike tin, was relatively abundant and widely available across many different regions, meaning that societies no longer needed to depend on long-distance trade networks. The very networks that had proven so fragile and so vulnerable during the Bronze Age collapse in order to produce effective weapons and tools. This shift toward ironworking did not happen instantly, and earlier forms of ironworking had actually already existed in limited forms even before the Great Collapse, particularly among the Hittites, who appear to have had some early knowledge of iron smelting techniques. But it was in the centuries following the Bronze Age collapse, as societies across the region searched for ways to rebuild their military and economic strength without depending on the old broken trading networks, that ironworking spread and developed much more widely, eventually replacing bronze as the dominant metal for weapons and tools across most of the ancient world. There is something genuinely poetic in this technological shift when we really think about it carefully. The very interdependence and specialization that had made the Bronze Age world so prosperous and so impressive, that elaborate web of trade routes connecting Cypriot copper mines to distant tin sources to Hittite forges to Egyptian markets, was also precisely the vulnerability that had allowed the entire system to collapse so quickly and so completely once enough of its connecting threads were broken simultaneously. The Iron Age that emerged afterward, by contrast, was built on a foundation of greater independence and resilience. Individual societies no longer needing to depend so heavily on fragile, far-reaching trade networks just to arm and equip themselves. In this sense, the technological shift from bronze to iron represents, in its own quiet way, one of the most direct and lasting lessons of the entire Bronze Age collapse. A civilizational adaptation born directly from the hard, painful experience of watching an overly interdependent system fail catastrophically. As we look across this transformed landscape, this new world slowly emerging from the long shadow of the Bronze Age collapse, it becomes worth returning, one final time tonight, to the central mystery that has run throughout our entire story. Who exactly were the Sea Peoples? After everything we have explored together tonight, after walking through the prosperous, interconnected world that existed before them, after tracing the earliest documented encounters under Meneptah, after following the cascading destruction that swept across Ugarit and Hattusa and the Mycenaean palace centres, after watching Ramesses III successfully defend Egypt against their final great assault, and after exploring everything that emerged from the wreckage they helped create, do we actually know who they truly were? The honest answer, even now, even after more than a century of dedicated archaeological excavation and historical research, remains genuinely uncertain in many important ways. We know the names the Egyptians gave to various groups within this broad coalition: the Shurden, the Luka, the Ekwesh, the Teresh, the Shekelesh, the Peleset, the Cheka, the Denyen, the Weshish. We have reasonable, evidence-based theories connecting some of these groups to specific regions, the Luka likely from southwestern Anatolia, the Shurden possibly connected to Sardinia, the Ekwesh possibly connected to the Mycenaean Achaeans, the Peleset almost certainly connected to the later Philistines who settled in Canaan. But we do not have a single, unified, definitive answer explaining exactly where this entire phenomenon originated, exactly how these different groups came together, or exactly what combination of displacement, opportunism, desperation, and ambition drove their actions across these critical decades of history. What we can say, with genuine confidence built on more than a century of careful historical and archaeological work, is that the Sea Peoples were not, as they were sometimes portrayed in older, more simplified historical narratives, a single unified invading horde sweeping in from some unknown distant land to senselessly destroy a peaceful, thriving civilization. They were, instead, something far more complex, and in many ways far more human. They appear to have been multiple distinct groups, likely originating from several different regions across the Aegean, Anatolia, and the wider Mediterranean world. Groups who were themselves victims of the same broader systemic collapse we traced throughout our story tonight. Driven from their own homelands by drought, by earthquakes, by the breakdown of the very trade networks and political systems that had once sustained them. Displaced and desperate, they moved across the eastern Mediterranean in search of new places to settle, sometimes through violent raiding and conquest, and sometimes, it seems, simply by establishing new communities wherever they found space to do so. In this sense, perhaps the deepest and most lasting lesson of the entire Sea People story is not really about any single group of mysterious invaders at all. It is about the genuine fragility of even the most prosperous, sophisticated, and seemingly stable civilizations when those civilizations become too dependent on complex, interconnected systems that have little capacity to absorb multiple serious shocks arriving all at once. It is about how climate change, even climate change driven by entirely natural causes rather than human activity, as was certainly the case more than 3,000 years ago, can place such severe pressure on agricultural societies that it sets in motion waves of migration and conflict capable of toppling even the most powerful empires of their age. And it is, perhaps most movingly of all, a story about how even total catastrophic collapse, the kind of total civilizational devastation that erased an entire superpower so completely that human memory forgot it had ever existed for over 3,000 years, does not necessarily mean a true and permanent end. From the ashes of the Hittite Empire and the ruins of Ugarit and the abandoned, silent palace halls of Mycenaean Pylos, new peoples eventually emerged. The Phoenicians, who gave the wider world its alphabet. The Philistines, whose long, complicated history would echo forward through religious tradition for thousands of years. The Israelites, who found space to grow and organize once the old dominant powers had weakened or disappeared entirely. The early Greek city-states, which would eventually give rise, centuries later, to philosophy, to democracy, to literature that remains profoundly influential even today. In our own modern world, more than 3,000 years removed from the collapse that helped create the conditions for their emergence. The world Ramesses III successfully defended, the wounded, weakened but still surviving Egypt that emerged from this entire enormous crisis, would itself continue for many more centuries, slowly declining in relative power and influence, but never disappearing in the dramatic, total way the Hittite Empire had vanished. And the mysterious peoples who had caused so much destruction across the wider Mediterranean world, who remain, even after everything we have explored together tonight, still genuinely mysterious in so many important ways, left behind a legacy far more complicated and far more interesting than simple destruction alone. They were destroyers, yes, in many real and significant ways, but they were also, in their own scattered, complicated way, founders, settlers and ancestors woven permanently into the long, unbroken thread of human history that connects that distant, vanished Bronze Age world all the way forward to our own modern world today, more than 3,000 years later. Where you are listening to this story, perhaps drifting towards sleep, perhaps already there, carried gently across the centuries by the same enduring human impulse that has always driven us to tell each other stories about where we came from and how we managed against every reasonable expectation to survive. Are you still awake out there? If you are, I hope tonight's journey through the mystery of the Sea Peoples gave you something gentle to drift off to, something to wonder about quietly as your eyes grow heavy. Our next story is already queued up and ready to begin on its own, so you can simply let it play and keep drifting if you're not quite asleep yet. And if you enjoyed spending this time with me tonight, it would mean a great deal if you left a like on this video, subscribed if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what you'd like to hear about next. Until then, get cozy, let your thoughts settle, and have yourself a truly good night's sleep.